We are now in Season 5 of the Outlast Trials. Let me tell you, things are heating up. Well, not really, as we're actually in the cold snap at Sinyala for winter kills, but in terms of lore, wow, there's some juicy stuff to discuss today. As I say in all these videos, if you are after comprehensive rundowns of all the lore from the previous 4 seasons, then check out the videos down in the description. Season 1 was establishing where and what Sinyala is along with the trials, and teasing an escaped reagent. Season 2 was that reagent Amelia plotting and planning her escape, but ended with her being captured by Murkoff. Season 3 was the fallout of that escape, in which hundreds of reagents did manage to do so, and Season 4 was all about establishing a more political aspect, linked to what's going on in the in-game and real-world universe, in which the US presidential election between JFK and Nixon is ramping up. Season 4 also saw certain trial programs designed to curb side effects and behaviours that the reagents were exhibiting on their release. Season 4 gave us a brand new Prime. 2, the Crest twins were helping Murkoff improve their effectiveness of the brainwashing by using chemical compounds. Season 5 sees us get a brand new Prime asset, Liliya Bogomolova, whose story and inclusion into the lore is exceptional. Probably my favourite Prime asset so far. As well as her, we also get her designated trial environment, the Ski Lodge, which coincides with the seasonal Winter Kills update. We also got a new comic from Outlast series writer JT Petty and the Black Frog, which we'll be looking at today too. So there's a lot to cover. We're now going to dive in, and there are going to be spoilers for the Outlast series here, so beware. On the 5th of February 1952, CIA Director Alan Welsh Dulles writes to a CIA agent, a man who served in naval intelligence in Bern with him during World War II, and he's now stationed in Europe. This agent's name is George Nichols. He's writing to Nichols as he wants him to investigate missing funds from something known as the MSA Fund. The MSA is the Mutual Security Act. MSA was set up in 1951 in order to help underdeveloped countries, friends of the US, halt the spread of communism. It was formerly called the Marshall Plan and was also used to help wealthy industrialists and rich families rebuild Europe after the war. But anyway, Dulles states that tens of millions of dollars have vanished. The wealthy people were going missing along with the money, and the CIA wants some answers. It seems that George had a theory regarding Liliya Bogomolova, and Alan Dulles urged him to press into that, giving him full authority to do an investigation, but George would end up becoming obsessed by her. After 3 days being in Paris, Nichols hired a translator who he may or may not have had an attraction to, and they end up looking into Liliya's history, along with what she got up to after the war. They found that Liliya was an only child to landowners in the USSR. Due to Joseph Stalin's Marxist revolutionary policies and his land grabs on peasant families they termed kulaks, a policy called dekulakization, this ended up in Liliya's parents being stripped of their land in Stalin's push for agriculture and for farms to be centralized and run by the state, as Stalin opposed the USSR's semi-feudal system and wanted to instead fund industrial development, which of course led to millions of people dying through execution, death whilst in camps, or by famine. Liliya then spent her teenage years in a Catholic orphanage in Paris. He'd found a newspaper article mentioning someone he believes to be Liliya. You recall from Season 4 that Liliya had acolytes, rich ones, and one of these was a man by the name of Jacques Treguet, who was found brutally maimed and mutilated. It was reported that Jacques completely abandoned his playboy lifestyle at some point and started to embrace his spiritual side prior to his gruesome death. Having tracked Liliya's movements, Nichols went to speak to the accountant of the Treguet family, pretty confident that with the state of the Treguet family finances, he will be able to get lots of useful information, and that he did. But what of that newspaper article? Well, the article from 1939 mentions the orphanage Liliya stayed at, St. Gaspar's, appealing for information on 11-year-old Liliya's family, that she had been found starving and held captive and inside a prison cell inside her family's home. Her age puts her at about age 32, about the time we see her in Trials, having been born around 1928. Anyway, there was a dead woman there in the house, and it was assumed to be Liliya's mother. Liliya was incapable of speech and was just grunting like an animal. Her condition indicated a lifetime of abuse, so naturally authorities wanted to find out who did this to her. Just over a week later, Nichols had tracked someone down who was also at the orphanage at the same time as Liliya, who the woman refers to as a feral child. She says that several years into the war, Liliya had actually left the orphanage on foot to go to St. Petersburg, back then being called Leningrad. The woman also claims that Liliya had learned to speak because God himself was talking to her. God had apparently told her to call herself Bogomolova. Bogomol is the Russian word for mantis, with over being the suffix for a Russian woman's name. God had told her that she was the Russian Joan of Arc, and to go there to Leningrad and to liberate it from the Hun. She became a deadly hunter, so deadly that the German officers saw her as an object of terror and fascination, and even Wernicke himself had heard of her. Germany then retreated from Stalingrad, but Liliya was captured by a Nazi officer. It wasn't without a fight though. After she slashed the face of the officer, he cut off the hand that she used to hold the knife. He then cut off her tongue after she cursed him. Then sometime later, in what George was told was a pure miracle, she prayed and her tongue grew back again. She considered it a new tongue though, with added gifts. She spoke to the Nazi officer's bodyguards and his staff, and managed to convince them to hold him down while she grabbed a knife, and after presumably killing him, she disappeared into the forests where she would go missing for years. Villagers and locals would find corpses transformed into religious statues. The woman George is speaking to talks about Liliya's obsession with the Bible, but one thing is important here, and one thing that links in with what we've just seen, is that Liliya was herself incredibly and overwhelmingly charismatic, which had a profound effect on the other girls at the orphanage while she was there. It's said that she had never seen her mother's face or seen sunlight until she was liberated from her prison, that the first face she ever saw was that of the police officer that saved her. That's all they get from this woman, but George Nichols planned to travel to Switzerland in order to speak to the Treguet family valet. And on the 25th of February, they'd found the valet, or what remained of him. He was able to give them a lot of information though, and the man seemed to speak about Liliya as if he was reciting a gospel. Liliya is considered a saint of sorts. Jacques Treguet had found his spiritual side through Liliya. She told him to sacrifice the evils of money and to sacrifice the evils of the flesh. Treguet was seemingly in charge or in receipt of funds from the Mutual Security Act, but he was not keeping them, he was burning them. This was him sacrificing the evils of money. He would self-mutilate just because Liliya told him to. The valet had done the same, as he too had fallen under the charismatic aura of Liliya. Her charismatic sway seemed to be way above that of your Leland Coyle or your Mother Gooseberry. This is the provocative specimen that Easterman was so eager for. But in an ominous twist of events, George Nichols is starting to feel dizzy and feels as if he has a fever. The valet had told him of a hunting lodge in the mountains, which Nichols imagined would be guarded. Over a month later, by April 1952, George writes that he's heard the voice of Liliya, that she'll allow them to bring her in, but that he needs to prepare gifts. So George would go there, and lo and behold, there was Liliya. Just as she did with the rich and powerful, the wealthy, he mutilated himself. Liliya would tell him that this was the instruction of God. He then took her to Mount Massive Hospital. As we know, the transfer of Liliya Bogomolova to Sinyala was a collaboration between Sinyala and Mount Massive Hospital, and we saw in Season 4 that Silas Knisley warned the staff at Sinyala that transporting her would be dangerous and costly. Another scene from the comic shows a conversation between Knisley and Wernicke, in which Wernicke is telling him all about Liliya's background after Knisley compared her to a dead dog since she's been sedated. Silas thought she was nothing special. Wernicke believes that bringing Liliya into Mount Massive was as much her idea as it was the CIA's. Where better to take her message than to the land of capitalism? Wernicke introduces Silas to some of her acolytes, patients, staff, doctors, administrators, all of them from Mount Massive, and they've been cutting themselves up on her instruction. He suggests that Silas may be in danger and seems very keen to send her to Sinyala. He says they're not sending them a dead dog, but instead a viper. Anyway, in a later meeting between Easterman, Knisley and Scarfiotti on the 3rd of November 1960, Scarfiotti is assuring Easterman and Knisley that containment will not be an issue. Knisley reminds him of the Amelia incident, but Easterman calls that a minor event, and that it was barely noticeable. Scarfiotti then explains that the designated area her trial is located in is surrounded by cold snap conditioning, so if she tries to leave it, she'll freeze to death. Knisley mentions Wernicke and hands them a bunch of files, not on Liliya, but on George Nichols. Since Scarfiotti served in Bern, alongside Alan Dulles, as a result he knows of George Nichols. Asking how he's doing, Knisley says that what's left of George only screams when the sedatives he's been given wear off. Wernicke has asked that he's included in record distribution when it comes to anything in regard to Liliya's therapy. Easterman objects, saying that what they're doing at Sinyala is nothing to do with his dream therapy, but Knisley responds, stating that Wernicke mentioned something about miracles and fructuous mistakes. A fructuous mistake is something that is considered a bad decision made, but one that has a benefit due to the lessons learned from it. He's done this before. Back in Season 1, when the director of behavioural medicine at Mount Massive, Olivier Baranchik, wrote to Avianos in 1959 about Wernicke talking about the creation of penicillin being the most fruitful mistake of the 21st century, and comparing that to what Murkoff were doing at Sinyala. This was a response to seeing Reagent 0877, heavily implied to be Simon Peacock from Outlast 1 in the Murkoff account comics, and as we know, Peacock became the first or the rough draft of the Wall Rider. This is what he means by a fruitful mistake. Easterman would go away and write in his trusty journal a few days later. He writes about Silas Knisley and about how he's a deeply unserious man. He wonders what kind of ship they're running over at Mount Massive, but states that he does not care as long as he can keep getting a good supply of provocative patients. He calls Liliya the test case. Easterman writes about how Liliya refuses to cooperate with them in interviews, but he says that each time he tries to leave the room, she mutters at him, throwing her voice, almost as if she's whispering in his ear. He can't understand the words, considering it a foreign tongue, but it makes his ears itch, deep inside his ear canal. He thinks it's ventriloquism, but one that instead channels the alter ego of Liliya's charismatic powers, much like Mother Gooseberry does with Dr. Futterman, who is the personification of her abusive father. He talks about the primal ventriloquist having to submit themselves to an unknowable force by accepting the primacy of the unreal. Interesting stuff. I think it's something else though. In Season 2, we learned of a reagent carving a series of words into a body that themselves spelled out one word, and that word was egregore. This is the name for a collective consciousness. A hive mind of sorts, which indicates that there's a hive mind here at Sinyala shared between those undergoing the therapy. It's possible as well that Amelia was using this to communicate with some of the reagents. But at this point it's not confirmed as it's just a theory. Easterman considers that she may be still having an effect on the reagents though, despite having been captured, and that he needs to wrest back control of his reagents. Anyway, when in the trial with Liliya, she speaks about the egregore, and it's just as Easterman experienced that we can hear her voice as if she's throwing it, like a ventriloquist would. But the reagents are somewhat able to make out what she's saying, although it is very difficult to understand her. She seems to be fully aware of the egregore and is speaking through it. But again, this is something that will likely be revealed over the course of Season 5, so we'll have to watch, listen, and wait. The following day, Wernicke has written to Avianos about Liliya. He's incredibly insistent about the dangers Liliya poses, that she's capable of deep and subtle manipulation of those in her proximity. He states that the scientific part of his brain burns with curiosity when it comes to the effects she may have on Sinyala. She targets the powerful, the narcissistic, and those driven by a sense of purpose and mission, and that these people seem especially vulnerable to her charms. He declines to mention a certain someone by name, but it's likely Easterman. Wernicke likely is aware that Easterman has been ordering staff at Sinyala to send copies of documents regarding him and certain subjects directly to him, so he's making sure this letter stays only for the eyes of Avianos. He asks Avianos to share what happens regarding this with him, indicating that Wernicke is fully expecting something interesting to happen to Easterman. I cannot wait to see how this plays out. Just under 3 weeks later, the Liliya trials have been underway, and Easterman is meeting with Moses Scarfiotti, and he seems concerned that Liliya may be cheating in the trials. She's been tracking the reagents with impossible precision. Yeah, and don't we know it. He's asking Scarfiotti if there's a flaw in the trial environment, or if she has access to security cameras or communications, but he says there are none. Easterman is bemused, and Scarfiotti tells Easterman that maybe it could be God telling her where to find the reagents. Easterman rubbishes this, but Scarfiotti asks him if he's listened to the things she's saying. He says it's nonsense, but it's clear here that she's speaking to many people in the facility, and this includes Scarfiotti. Finally, to finish, in the Project Diarchy update when the Crest twins arrived at Sinyala, Murkoff CIA liaison Jameson Lawler and Alice Avianos were speaking about the upcoming presidential debate between John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Richard Nixon. That the debate, for the first time in history, was to be televised. Well, that debate has now happened in the in-game timeline, and it's exactly as people thought it was, that Kennedy was deemed to have done better to those who watched, whilst Nixon was deemed to have done better to those who listened on the radio. In a later meeting between Lawler and Avianos, they're discussing US pilot Gary Powers, who was flying a U-2 spy plane over the USSR and got shot down, and was being held by the Soviets, where he was sentenced to 10 years for espionage. The way they're talking, it seems they may be suggesting that Gary Powers was a reagent. This potentially links into one of the newspapers from the Rebirth, which mentions a fire at the prison where Gary Powers was being held, which the CIA probably view as a failure. This is because it seems Lawler has some explaining to do with CIA top brass, but that's just a theory, of course. They speak about Cuba, and Avianos tells Lawler to tell them how helpful Murkoff were in their help with things over in Cuba, with Lupara. Lawler says they want to move on Cuba, and fast. And on the subject of Cuba, Lawler mentions their concern over Dick, which means Richard Nixon, and that he may just lose the election. They talk about Kennedy looking good on a televised debate, and that he made Nixon look like a shaved dachshund. They say they need to get Jack, Kennedy, off the air, and Avianos says that they, Murkoff, can help with that. Avianos says that TV is the future, and she puts together a proposal for him, and they then, well, yeah. This is one storyline that has caught my interest. But that's it for the latest lore roundup from the Outlast Trials. Some really cool stuff in here, and Season 5 is already shaping up to be an amazing one in terms of the wider goings on at Sinyala. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe if you aren't already. But for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.